Tonight, we begin with a trip you never, ever want to take, to a medieval hospital. And I'm using the word hospital here in the loosest sense possible. You're not about to walk into a clean, well-lit building filled with trained professionals. No. You're about to step into a place where the floors are straw. The cure for most illnesses is to make you bleed on purpose. And hygiene is an idea no one's really gotten around to yet. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments, if you had to choose, would you rather face the Black Death with a medieval doctor, or just take your chances without one? Now, dim the lights, maybe pour yourself something warm, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's set the scene. It's the 14th century. You've been coughing for days, your head feels like it's stuffed with wet wool, and there's a strange pain in your leg that's either a pulled muscle or a sign that your body is plotting against you. Whatever it is, it's not going away, so you decide to get help. You shuffle down a muddy lane toward the hospital. A stone building that's less state-of-the-art and more state of decay. The floor creaks as you push it open, releasing a smell so potent it could probably kill bacteria, if anyone here believed in bacteria. Inside, it's dim and smoky. Beds, if you can call a pile of straw a bed, line the walls. Every one of them is occupied. Some patients cough violently, others stare into the distance as if they've already given up. The air is thick with the sound of wheezing, groaning, and prayers mumbled under breath. A man in a worn brown robe approaches, Brother Thomas, the healer. His tools hang from his belt, a knife, a metal probe, a small pot of herbs. You get the feeling these items are used for everything. Toothache? Knife. Head wound? Knife. Persistent cough? Knife. And herbs. Before he treats you, he needs information. Your birth date, your star sign, and exactly when your symptoms began. After all, everyone knows disease comes from imbalanced humors and planetary mischief, not from the rat you stepped over on the way here. Soon, you're holding a small flask and being told to fill it. Moments later, Brother Thomas is holding your urine up to the light like a jeweler inspecting a rare gem. He swirls it, sniffs it, and, if you're very unlucky, tastes it. His face says he's either discovered something important or he's just remembered a bad meal from last week. You glance around the ward and realize something chilling. The people who leave here alive probably weren't that sick to begin with. You lie back on the straw, trying not to think about why it's moving slightly under you, and watch as Brother Thomas prepares his treatment. Whatever's about to happen, you can't shake the feeling that you might be leaving this place worse off than when you came in. So you've made it to a medieval hospital. Congratulations, I guess. Before you picture wards full of nurses in crisp uniforms, trays of medicine, and bustling doctors making their rounds, we need to adjust expectations. In the Middle Ages, the word hospital didn't mean place where you go to get better. It meant place where you go when you can't take care of yourself anymore, which is a much more depressing business model. These were institutions of hospitality. In fact, that's where the word comes from. And they were as much about shelter and spiritual care as they were about medicine, sometimes more so. Most hospitals weren't founded by civic authorities or medical boards. They were set up by monasteries, abbeys, and charitable religious orders. The Hôtel Dieu in Paris, founded in the 7th century and still technically in existence today, was attached to Notre Dame Cathedral and run entirely by nuns. St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London began as a priory in 1123, its wards managed by Augustinian monks. These places were designed to reflect Christian charity, feed the hungry, clothe the naked, tend to the sick. But in practice, the tending was often more about saving your soul than saving your life. The medieval mindset was clear. Your body was temporary, your soul eternal, and if one had to be prioritized, well, apologies to your gangrenous leg. Let's take a stroll into one of these wards. The building is usually stone or timber framed, drafty, and dimly lit. The smell hits you before you've even taken in the sight, a mix of wood smoke, sweat, unwashed bodies, chamber pots, and whatever herbal concoction is simmering over the hearth. The wards are long halls with beds, and I'm being generous with that word, arranged in rows. These beds are often wooden frames with sacks stuffed with straw or reeds. Sheets, if they exist, are coarse linen, rarely washed. Above you, beams are strung with drying herbs. Rosemary, sage, lavender. Some used in cooking, others in poultices. Their scent does little to mask the reality that you're sharing air with dozens of people at various stages of disease. You can hear the chorus, wheezing, hacking coughs, murmured prayers, the occasional delirious shout from someone halfway between fever and the next world. In the Hôtel Dieu, patients often lay two to a bed in busy times. And they weren't separated by illness type. Plague, leprosy, infected wounds, childbirth complications, all under the same roof. The idea of isolating contagious patients hadn't yet gained much traction, though some leper houses were set apart entirely from the town. Here in the general ward, however, you might arrive with a broken arm and leave with dysentery, typhus, and a deep distrust of community living. The people caring for you are almost never professional physicians. Those were rare, expensive, and often catered only to wealthy households. Your caregivers here are monks, nuns, and lay brothers, whose medical knowledge comes from a mix of reading ancient texts, memorizing herbal recipes, and plain trial and error. The training manuals? Think Hippocrates meets the Bible with a dash of folk superstition. A monk might read Galen's writings on balancing the humors one moment, then turn to a psalm the next, believing both to be equally important in your treatment. Some hospitals did occasionally bring in physicians for particularly wealthy or politically connected patients. But for everyone else, the care plan was a blend of charity, herbalism, and prayer. Life inside a medieval hospital followed a rhythm that blended spiritual duties with whatever physical care the staff could offer. Your day began early, often before sunrise, when the ringing of a bell or the soft shuffle of robes signaled morning prayers. Whether you could stand or not, you were expected to join in. Sometimes from your bed, sometimes by being helped or half carried to the chapel. The prayers might be short or they might stretch on, and for many patients, they were as much a part of treatment as any herbal remedy. Afterward came food, if you could call it that. A ladle of pottage, a thick gray stew of grains and vegetables, accompanied by coarse bread and, on a good day, a little cheese. There were no tailored diets here. Everyone ate the same, whether you were recovering from a fever or missing half your teeth. The physical care was variable. A nun might apply a poultice to a wound, change your bandages without bothering to wash your hands, or hand you an herbal drink brewed to cleanse the humors. If you were feverish or in obvious pain, you might find yourself on the receiving end of a bloodletting, whether or not your illness truly called for it. Between these treatments, there was more prayer, more religious counsel. Illness was often seen as the result of sin or as a divine test, and part of the hospital's role was to help you make peace with God. Confession and absolution were encouraged, sometimes daily, so that your soul would be in the best possible state should your body fail you. Evening brought another round of prayers before rest, a word that meant lying in a noisy, overcrowded hall on a straw-filled sack while the patient 2 beds over coughed relentlessly and the one next to you moaned about his boils. Sleep came in snatches, if at all, and you learned to be grateful for every quiet moment between the snores, wheezes, and death rattles of your neighbors. To modern eyes, it might seem odd to focus so heavily on prayer in a medical setting. But in the medieval worldview, body and soul were inseparable. If your soul was sick with sin, your body could hardly be expected to recover. Diseases were often interpreted as divine punishment or as tests of faith. Healing the soul through confession, communion, or pilgrimage was thought to help heal the body. And if it didn't, well, at least your soul was in better shape for what came next. Some hospitals were even built with chapels directly adjoining the wards, so patients could hear Mass from their beds. The Hotel Dieu's main hall had the altar at one end and the beds arranged so patients could look toward it. The 14th century register from St. Bartholomew's Hospital lists patients with everything from broken bones to ague, or fever, the falling sickness, epilepsy, and the pox, probably syphilis. Treatments recorded include herbal salves for wounds, cauterization with heated metal, wine mixed with herbs to cleanse the humors, and, of course, plenty of prayers. One unlucky patient with a compound fracture had his bones set and then bound with cloths soaked in vinegar and wine. He survived for 2 weeks, long enough for the wound to fester, before the record tersely notes he passed to God. The hospital's mission wasn't purely medical, it was also social and spiritual. Poor travelers, orphans, and the elderly were housed alongside the sick. Some people came here not to recover, but to die, to spend their final days in a holy place tended by religious brothers and sisters. And in a way, these hospitals did provide an important service. They offered shelter, food, and some level of care in a world where many would otherwise be left to fend for themselves in the streets. But if you came here hoping for a swift cure and a discharge with a clean bill of health, you might leave disappointed, or not at all. In short, medieval hospitals were a strange hybrid of charity house, religious retreat, and experimental ward. You came in with a cough, got your soul forgiven, your head shaved, a bowl of stew, and, if the staff had time, maybe even a bandage on that wound. Whether you walked out healed or were carried out wrapped in a shroud, that was in God's hands. So, you've made it through the hospital doors and into a bed, or at least into a spot on the straw pile. Now comes the critical moment, figuring out what's actually wrong with you. In our modern world, diagnosis means thermometers, blood tests, scans, and a small army of specialists. In the Middle Ages, it meant none of those things. The most advanced technology here was a candle and the human imagination. And yet, medieval medicine did have a system. Not a good system by modern standards, but one with rules, logic, and centuries of tradition behind it. Unfortunately, that tradition was often wrong in ways that could be lethal. The foundation of medical diagnosis was the theory of the 4 humors, borrowed from ancient Greek and Roman medicine, especially the works of Hippocrates and Galen. Your body, according to this theory, was basically a soup made of 4 main fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor was linked to specific qualities: hot or cold, wet or dry, and also to personality traits. Too much blood made you sanguine, cheerful, talkative, prone to rosy cheeks. Too much phlegm made you phlegmatic, calm, slow, and maybe a bit lazy. Excess yellow bile made you choleric, irritable, quick-tempered, with a face that flushed easily. And too much black bile made you melancholic, sad, brooding, and pale. Illness, they believed, was simply a matter of imbalance. Fever? You probably had too much heat in your system. Time to bleed you or give you something cooling. Cough with mucus? Clearly an excess of phlegm. You might need drying herbs or a brisk walk in cold air. Depressed? Melancholy from too much black bile. Let's purge it out and hope you feel better. This system was so ingrained that even minor symptoms were interpreted through it. Modern science hadn't yet identified bacteria or viruses, so the idea that your cough might be caused by something invisible living in your lungs was completely alien. The cause had to be in your own fluids. Fluids which, to the medieval mind, could be drained, purged, or balanced like a garden pond. If the humors were the foundation, astrology was the window dressing. Many medieval physicians consulted the heavens before making a diagnosis. The position of the planets and stars at the time your illness began could be as important as the symptoms you described. This wasn't considered superstition, it was serious science for the time. The idea was that the human body was a microcosm of the universe. Moments in the heavens echoed in your organs, so Saturn's sulky glare could make your spleen act up, while Jupiter's smile might improve your digestion. Some hospitals and physicians kept elaborate astrological charts. You might find your healer hunched over parchment, measuring angles between celestial bodies with a brass astrolabe. Then, pronouncing your leg wound would heal faster if treated when the moon was in Virgo rather than Scorpio. If you were lucky enough to get sick under a bad planetary alignment, treatment might be delayed for days until the stars were more favorable. If you've ever been to a modern doctor and given a urine sample, you can thank the medievals for popularizing the practice, though their methods were different. Urine analysis, or uroscopy, was considered one of the most reliable diagnostic tools. Your doctor would examine a flask of your urine, holding it up to the light to study its color, clarity, and any sediments floating inside. They compared it to detailed urine charts that illustrated everything from pale yellow, thought to mean you were healthy or slightly overheated, to deep red. Bad news, possibly bleeding somewhere inside. Smell was also a factor. A sweet smell might be interpreted as one illness, a foul stench as another. And yes, some physicians tasted it. They swore they could detect subtle flavors that indicated particular diseases. Though it's not clear if this actually improved accuracy or just gave them a reputation at the dinner table. The urine's behavior in a flask was also noted. Did it froth when shaken? Did the sediment sink or float? These were all clues, apparently. The patient's actual description of their symptoms was often secondary to the evidence in that little clay or glass bottle. The next step was to feel your pulse. This wasn't just to see if you were alive, though given medieval survival rates, that was probably step one. Physicians believed that changes in the rhythm, speed, or strength of your pulse could indicate which humor was out of balance. A fast, bounding pulse might mean an excess of heat. A slow, weak one could point to cold and damp inside you. Unfortunately, without any understanding of circulation or blood pressure, pulse reading was less a science and more an interpretive dance. Two physicians could feel the same patient's pulse and come to completely different conclusions, though both would be equally confident in their diagnosis. Visual inspection was, of course, part of the process. Physicians looked at your skin tone, the brightness of your eyes, the texture of your tongue, even the way you moved. But these observations were always interpreted through the lens of humors, astrology, and other prevailing theories. If your skin was flushed and hot, they saw heat in the blood. If it was pale and clammy, they saw excess phlegm. A trembling hand could be a sign of too much cold and dry, or perhaps a side effect of being terrified that your doctor might bring out the leeches. To us, this all sounds wildly unscientific, And it was, but it was also internally consistent. Once you accepted the four humors as truth, the rest of the system made sense. Treatments could be justified logically, even if they didn't work. And because people sometimes recovered naturally, these recoveries reinforced the belief that the system was correct. Add to that the prestige of ancient authorities like Galen, whose writings were treated almost as sacred texts, and you have a recipe for centuries of unquestioned tradition. Physicians who tried to suggest new theories often found themselves ignored, mocked, or even accused of heresy if their ideas contradicted accepted doctrine. Getting diagnosed in the Middle Ages was like mixing equal parts horoscope, color swatch test, wine tasting, and enthusiastic guesswork. And once your healer had decided which humor was out of whack, they'd move on to the fun part, balancing it, which often meant bleeding, purging, or other treatments that could make your illness the least of your problems. In the medieval mind, once your doctor had figured out which of your four precious bodily fluids was out of balance, the next step was obvious. Get it back in balance. And by obvious, I mean guaranteed to make you feel worse before you felt better. If you ever felt better at all. The treatments used to restore humoral balance were often as dramatic as the illnesses themselves. The theory was simple. If you had too much of something, take it away. If you had too little, add more. In practice, that usually meant bloodletting, vomiting, purging, sweating, or all of the above. A medieval detox plan, but without the Instagram smoothie bowls. If there was one cure medieval medicine truly loved, it was bloodletting. Fever? Bloodletting. Headache? Bloodletting. Bad mood? Definitely bloodletting. The reason was straightforward. If your blood was too hot or too plentiful, it needed to be drained. One of the most common ways to do this was venesection, which involved using a sharp knife or lancet to open a vein, often in the arm, and letting the blood flow into a waiting bowl. For a slower, supposedly more controlled approach, leeches were the preferred choice. These little segmented vampires were placed directly on the skin to drink their fill, which some practitioners considered gentler for delicate or elderly patients. Another method, scarification, involved making multiple shallow cuts with a small blade, then pressing cups or sponges to the wounds to draw out the blood. Bloodletting wasn't just about quantity, timing was everything. Many physicians consulted astrological charts to determine the most favorable day for the procedure, believing that celestial alignments could influence the body's receptiveness to healing. They also believed certain veins were connected to specific organs, so a headache might call for bleeding from the forehead or arm, while stomach troubles might require draining blood from the leg. Unfortunately, the patient's health rarely improved, and in many cases, it deteriorated rapidly due to blood loss, infection, or both. Some patients fainted mid-procedure, others never woke up again. But if the patient died, the explanation was simple. The illness had been too far gone to save. Certainly not the fault of the treatment. Sometimes the problem wasn't too much blood. It was corrupted humors in the digestive system. The solution? Empty the system as quickly as possible. Purging could mean inducing diarrhea with herbal laxatives, some of which were relatively mild, like senna or rhubarb, and some of which were chemical nightmares, like mercury or antimony. These harsher substances often caused severe dehydration, which was not ideal for someone already weakened by illness. In more extreme cases, patients were given enemas to flush out the bowels. The enema fluid might be warm water, herbal infusions, or even mixtures containing wine or vinegar. The logic was that the liquid would draw out the offending humor and restore balance. If the problem was thought to reside in the stomach, the cure was to get it out, fast. Emetics, substances that cause vomiting, were prescribed for everything from indigestion to melancholy. Some were herbal, like ipecacuanha root, but others were downright brutal, combinations of soap, salt water, or even copper compounds. Patients would retch until their bodies felt wrung out like wet laundry. The physician would then smile with satisfaction, declaring that the harmful humor had been expelled. Whether the patient agreed with this assessment was irrelevant. Another method for balancing the humors was to force the body to sweat. This was believed to drive out impurities through the skin. Patients might be wrapped in heavy blankets near a roaring fire, placed in small heated rooms, or given hot herbal drinks to encourage sweating. While mild sweating could sometimes help with certain ailments, the medieval version often went too far, leaving patients dangerously dehydrated and exhausted. In cases of contagious disease, it also meant locking sick people in hot, enclosed spaces together, the perfect recipe for spreading illness. For particularly stubborn illnesses, physicians might combine treatments, bleed the patient, then give them an emetic, then wrap them in blankets to sweat. The goal was a thorough cleansing of the humors from every angle. Of course, this all-fronts approach also maximized the risk of shock, dehydration, and death. But if the patient died, the doctor could at least say they had tried everything. One famous example comes from the 14th century, where King Charles II of Navarre fell ill. His physicians prescribed repeated bleedings, purges, and emetics, weakening him to the point where he could barely move. The final straw came when an attempt to warm his limbs with brandy-soaked cloths resulted in the cloths catching fire, killing him instantly. While this was technically an accident, his body had already been pushed to the edge by the treatments. Records from the Paris Faculty of Medicine show that bloodletting was prescribed for plague victims, fevers, wounds, and even childbirth recovery. A surviving case note from a London surgeon details a patient with hot humors in the head, treated with bleeding from the arm, a purgative of herbs and vinegar, and 3 days in a heated chamber to sweat, after which the patient expired in peace. To modern eyes, this is madness. But in the medieval framework, these methods made sense. If you believed illness came from excess or corruption inside the body, removing fluids was a logical fix. Patients who survived often credited the treatment, reinforcing the cycle. Those who didn't, well, they couldn't exactly complain. Also, there weren't many alternatives. Refusing treatment meant you were simply left to your illness, with no care at all. For many, the hope, however misplaced, that these procedures might help was better than doing nothing. Balancing the humors was the guiding principle of medieval medicine, and it was pursued with determination, creativity, and absolutely no regard to germ theory. Whether through knives, herbs, heat, or the sheer force of will, your physician was going to make those humors behave, even if it killed you in the process. If balancing the humors with bloodletting and purging was unpleasant, medieval surgery was something else entirely. It was the moment when the soothing prayers and herbal teas gave way to sharp steel, glowing hot irons, and the kind of pain that could make even the most pious patient reconsider their faith. In the absence of anesthesia, antibiotics, and sterile technique, surgery was a brutal, dangerous business. It was reserved for injuries too obvious to ignore: broken bones, arrow wounds, large abscesses, and the occasional unlucky patient with something lodged in their skull. And while some surgeons had remarkable skill for their time, the odds of leaving the operating table alive and infection-free were rarely in your favor. Contrary to what you might expect, Surgeon in the medieval world did not necessarily mean someone with a university education. In fact, many surgeries were performed by barber-surgeons. Yes, the same person who might trim your beard in the morning could be sawing through your leg by the afternoon. University-trained physicians, when they existed, considered surgery a low-status craft, something more akin to butchery than medicine. So the cutting was left to those with practical experience rather than book learning. Some barber surgeons were highly competent, apprenticed for years under masters who passed down techniques refined on battlefields and in crowded towns. Others, well, let's just say their qualifications were mostly that they owned a sharp knife and had steady hands after a pint of ale. One of the most common surgeries was amputation. If a limb was crushed, infected, or badly wounded, removing it was often the only option. The procedure was straightforward in the most horrifying sense. Restrain the patient, cut through the flesh quickly, saw through the bone, and cauterize the stump with a hot iron to stop the bleeding. Patients frequently fainted from shock, which in this context was probably a blessing. Another regular procedure was trepanning, drilling or cutting a hole in the skull to relieve pressure from head injuries, release evil spirits, or treat seizures. This could be done with a hand-cranked drill or small circular saw. Remarkably, some patients survived trepanning and even lived for years afterward, though many did not. Wound stitching was another staple, often performed after battlefield injuries. Needles were large, thread was coarse, and the process was agonizing. The stitches were not sterile, so even a neatly closed wound could turn septic within days. Wars, of course, provided endless opportunities for surgical practice. Military surgeons had to work fast, often on multiple patients at once, with no clean water and only a tent for shelter. Arrow removal was a frequent task, but arrows often had barbed tips, which could cause further damage if pulled out carelessly. Some surgeons used hollow metal tubes to push down around the arrowhead, flattening the barbs before extraction. Others simply yanked and hoped for the best. Sword cuts, spear thrusts, and crushed bones from maces or falling horses required quick decisions. Stitch it, splint it, or take it off. The noise of battle was replaced by the cries of the wounded, the hiss of cauterizing irons, and the smell of burning flesh. Cauterization was used not only to stop bleeding, but also to clean wounds. The theory was that heat could drive out bad humors or poisons. In practice, this meant pressing a red-hot iron, heated in the fire until it glowed, directly against the wound. The pain was unimaginable, but so was the alternative of bleeding out. Another variation was boiling oil treatment, famously used in the late Middle Ages for gunshot wounds. Surgeons would pour scalding oil into the wound, believing it would neutralize any harmful substances introduced by the gunpowder. Ambroise Paré, a 16th century French surgeon, accidentally discovered that this was more likely to kill the patient than heal them when he ran out of oil and treated soldiers with a simple herbal balm instead, and found they recovered much better. Surgical work also extended to the mouth. Tooth extraction was a rough and ready process involving pliers, tongs, or even bare fingers if the tooth was loose enough. There were no numbing agents, just a quick, brutal yank and maybe a swig of strong drink afterward. The tooth might come out cleanly, or it might shatter, requiring a surgeon to dig out the fragments one by one. Without antiseptics, any surgery carried a huge risk of infection. The instruments, knives, saws, probes, were rarely, if ever, cleaned between patients. A surgeon might go straight from lancing a boil to amputating a leg with the same blade, wiping it on his apron in between. Shock, blood loss, and sepsis killed countless patients, But when surgery worked, when a shattered bone was set properly or a dangerous arrowhead removed, it could be life-saving. In a world with so few effective treatments, these small victories were enough to keep the practice going. Perhaps the most remarkable part of medieval surgery was the willingness of patients to endure it. With no anesthesia beyond alcohol or biting down on a piece of wood, undergoing surgery required immense courage, or the realization that it was your only chance to live. Stories survive of soldiers, peasants, and nobles alike gritting their teeth through amputations, trepanning, and other ordeals, sometimes even thanking the surgeon afterward. In the medieval world, surgery was a gamble, one in which you wagered pain, blood, and life itself against the slim chance of survival. For some, it was a miracle. For many others, it was simply the last thing they ever experienced. If the medieval surgeon was the grim figure working in a battlefield tent or monastic infirmary, the barber-surgeon was his more approachable cousin, part healer, part hairdresser, part neighborhood gossip. You didn't have to be gravely wounded to visit one. In fact, most people met their local barber-surgeon for entirely routine reasons: to get a shave, have a tooth pulled, or drain an abscess that had been making life miserable. The barber's shop was rarely a shop in the modern sense. More often, it was a corner of a busy marketplace, a stall in a covered arcade, or even a bench set up on the street. The famous red and white barber pole, which came to symbolize the trade, represented the blood and bandages of their dual profession. The white for the clean cloths, and the pole itself recalling the stick patients gripped during the procedure to keep their arms steady. In the medieval world, bloodletting wasn't only a cure for illness, it was also considered preventative medicine. A healthy man might visit his barber-surgeon once a season to have a pint or so removed, the same way you go in for a dental cleaning today. It was believed to keep the humors in balance, ward off fevers, and generally freshen the blood. The process was casual compared to the solemn atmosphere of a hospital. The barber might be halfway through trimming someone's beard when he glanced over at you and said, "Arm out then." Within moments, the leather strap was tied, the lancet was in, and a steady stream of blood trickled into a basin. Customers often chatted during the procedure, discussing crop prices, town gossip, or the latest royal scandal. Dentistry was another coarse service. Toothaches were a common misery in an age of coarse bread, gritty flour, and no toothbrushes. When the pain became unbearable, you went to the barber-surgeon for relief, which meant extraction. Forget the sterile dental office with its reclining chair. You sat on a wooden stool, possibly outdoors, and opened wide while the barber selected an iron tool from his kit. He'd grip the offending tooth with pliers or a pelican, a curved beak-like instrument, and twist hard. If the tooth was stubborn, he might brace his knee against your chest for leverage. The crowd gathered nearby would cheer when the tooth finally came free, often with a small spray of blood for dramatic effect. In busy markets, a skilled barber-surgeon might extract half a dozen teeth in a row, each patient staggering off relieved or at least distracted by the shock of it. Not all visits were so extreme. Barber-surgeons also lanced boils, drained cysts, stitched small cuts, and cleaned infected wounds. They kept a stock of herbal salves and ointments, usually a pungent blend of animal fat, beeswax, and medicinal plants. If your problem was more internal, they might mix you a draft to drink, often a concoction that could double as furniture polish, or send you home with a packet of dried herbs to brew as tea. These minor procedures had an almost casual air. A farmer might wander in with a nasty splinter under his fingernail and leave 10 minutes later bandaged and back to his cart. An apprentice might come in for a nick from a chisel and leave with a stitched-up palm. For all the risks, the barber-surgeon was the closest thing most people had to urgent care. The Barber-Surgeon's stall wasn't just a medical facility, it was a social hub. While waiting for your turn in the chair, you might overhear local disputes, hear news from travelers, or get an update on the latest scandal involving the Lord's steward. The air was thick with the smells of hair clippings, hot irons, herbal ointments, and the faint metallic tang of fresh blood. It was a place where the boundaries between medicine, grooming, and everyday life blurred. You might come in to have your beard shaped and leave with your ear lanced. The man who had been trimming your fringe moments ago might, without a trace of irony, be wiping your blood off his apron and moving on to the next customer. Despite the risks, and there were plenty, the barber-surgeon filled an essential niche. He was affordable, accessible, and willing to treat ailments that the monastery infirmary wouldn't bother with. In towns and villages without a resident physician, he was the one person you could count on to do something about your problem, even if that something hurt like hell and carried the risk of infection. And for all their rough methods, many barber surgeons built reputations for skill. A steady hand with the lancet, a quick and clean tooth pull, or a knack for setting a broken finger could earn them loyal customers for years. Of course, one bad cut or an unlucky case of gangrene could end that career just as quickly. Not every medieval patient could afford the attention of a physician, and even a trip to the barber surgeon was beyond some purses. In villages far from urban centers, medicine often came from a neighbor with a bag of herbs, a local wise woman, or a tattered family recipe passed down for generations. The line between healthcare, magic, and pure guesswork was blurry at best, and the remedies themselves ranged from mildly helpful to lethally absurd. These treatments were often rooted in tradition older than Christianity, drawing on pagan practices, astrology, and folklore. A dose of superstition was as important as any physical ingredient, and healing could be as much about the performance, the chants, the charms, the timing, as it was about the actual remedy. Herbs were the backbone of folk medicine. Plants like chamomile, sage, and rosemary were widely used for everything from soothing digestion to warding off evil spirits. Nettles might be boiled into a tonic for joint pain, while yarrow was pressed into wounds to stop bleeding. Some of these treatments had a kernel of real pharmacological value. Willow bark, for example, contains salicin, a natural pain reliever related to modern aspirin. But without precise doses or understanding of side effects, these same herbs could be dangerous. A strong brew of foxglove could help a failing heart in small amounts, or stop it entirely if the dose was wrong. When the garden wasn't enough, folk healers turned to the animal kingdom. Powdered deer antler was considered a strength booster, dried earthworms were brewed into cough syrup, and pigeon droppings were smeared on swollen joints. One recipe for curing baldness called for boiling a fox in oil and rubbing the resulting grease into the scalp. For whooping cough, a child might be fed a mixture containing spider webs and honey. Some remedies leaned toward the mystical. Powdered toad taken with wine was thought to protect against certain fevers, while swallowing a live frog supposedly cured asthma. Then there was mummy powder, ground-up remains of embalmed corpses imported from Egypt and sold as a cure for internal bleeding and bruises. It was expensive and fashionable among the wealthy in later centuries, but folk healers sometimes offered cheaper, local versions made from the remains of executed criminals. Healing wasn't just about swallowing or applying something. It could also mean carrying a protective charm or performing a specific ritual. A toothache might be treated by touching it with a dead man's tooth, preferably taken from someone who'd been hanged. Warts could be transferred to a piece of meat and buried. As the meat rotted, the wart would supposedly vanish. Timing was crucial for certain remedies. A poultice applied while the moon was waxing was thought to encourage growth and healing. During the waning moon, it could be used to shrink and dispel illness. Some healers insisted that specific herbs be picked only on Midsummer's Eve or at dawn on a Sunday to ensure their potency. Christianity didn't erase folk practices. It often merged with them. Holy water might be mixed into an herbal infusion or a healing prayer spoken over a poultice. Relics of saints could be pressed against wounds, or a patient might be instructed to walk around a certain church 3 times while reciting specific verses. This blending could produce odd hybrids. A cure for fever might involve both the recitation of the Lord's Prayer and the wearing of a sachet containing dried bat hearts. For many, it didn't seem contradictory. God had made the plants and animals after all, so using them alongside prayer was simply making full use of His gifts. For every harmless herbal tea, there was a remedy that could poison you outright. Lead and mercury were sometimes included in ointments for skin conditions. Arsenic was used to treat ulcers or kill parasites, but too much could stop your heart. Even the herbal standbys could be deadly if misidentified. Mistaking hemlock for parsley, for example, could be a fatal error. The lack of formal training meant that doses were guesswork, and the same illness might be treated entirely differently in 2 neighboring villages. Success stories circulated quickly, but failures, or outright fatalities, were more likely to be attributed to the patient's sins, the alignment of the stars, or the stubbornness of the disease rather than the remedy itself. Despite the risks, folk medicine endured because it was accessible, familiar, and sometimes effective. In remote areas, the local wise woman or cunning man might be the only source of care for miles. They knew the land, the plants, and the people, and they often had reputations built over years of service. Even when their cures failed, patients valued the comfort and attention they received. A healer who listened to your troubles, prepared a remedy with care, and gave you hope could be as important as the medicine itself, especially in an age when the alternative might be being ignored in a crowded hospital ward or subjected to a physician's more brutal interventions. Folk remedies were the medicine of the everyday medieval world, messy, inconsistent, and steeped in superstition, but also born of centuries of trial, error, and sheer necessity. They could heal, harm, or do nothing at all, but they offered something invaluable: the feeling that, in the face of illness, you were at least doing something. It's one thing to be sick in the Middle Ages. It's another thing entirely to be sick with something contagious. In a world without germ theory, people didn't understand exactly how diseases spread, but they knew enough to fear proximity. If your illness made you a danger to others, or even if people just thought you did, your life could change very quickly. You might be whisked away to a special building, kept at a suspicious distance, or forced to wear a strange costume so everyone could spot you coming. The goal wasn't always to cure you. More often, it was to contain you, or, if we're being honest, to make you someone else's problem. Few images are more iconic or more misleading than the medieval plague doctor. The long black cloak, the wide-brimmed hat, and, of course, the sinister bird-like mask with its glass eye openings and long, curved beak. The mask wasn't a fashion statement. The beak was stuffed with aromatic herbs like rosemary, mint, and lavender, along with camphor or vinegar-soaked sponges. Physicians believed that bad air, miasma, carried disease, and the herbs were meant to purify what the doctor breathed in. The glass lenses over the eyes added some protection from the poisonous vapors that supposedly caused plague. The outfit was essentially early personal protective equipment. The long, waxed cloak could be wiped down, and the gloves kept infected sores or fluids off the skin. The cane the doctor carried wasn't for walking. It was for examining patients from a safe distance, lifting blankets, or shooing away desperate relatives. Plague doctors didn't just treat victims. They also kept records of the dead, sometimes helped organize burials, and, in some cases, even handled wills. If you saw one walking toward your house, it was never good news. Long before the Black Death swept through Europe, leprosy was the most feared contagious disease. Known today as Hansen's disease, it causes skin lesions, nerve damage, and, in advanced stages, severe disfigurement. In the medieval mind, it was more than just a physical illness. It was a mark of moral and spiritual corruption. Those diagnosed were often removed from their communities and placed in leprosaria, leper houses or leper colonies, located outside town walls. In some cases, a leper had to go through a symbolic funeral when they were diagnosed, marking them as socially dead. Inside the leper house, life was strict but not necessarily cruel. Residents lived together, grew food, and sometimes worked in trades. They could leave the colony, but when they did, they were often required to wear distinctive clothing and carry a clapper or bell to warn others of their approach. Leper houses weren't designed to cure anyone. They were designed to keep lepers away from everyone else, a form of quarantine that could last the rest of a person's life. During plague outbreaks, many towns designated specific buildings as pest houses, makeshift hospitals for anyone suspected of carrying the disease. These were often hastily converted barns, warehouses, or old inns set far enough from the main population to reduce risk. The conditions were grim. Pest houses were overcrowded, poorly ventilated, and staffed by whoever was desperate enough to take the job. Food and water were brought in, but medical care was minimal. The goal was not recovery, but isolation. Once you were inside, you might not leave, not because you were cured, but because you were dead. The word quarantine comes from the Italian 40 giorni, 40 days, the length of isolation required for ships suspected of carrying plague before they could dock. Venice pioneered the practice in the 14th century, setting up special quarantine stations on nearby islands. Passengers and cargo alike had to wait out the period before entering the city. On land, similar measures existed. Some towns posted guards at the gates to keep out travelers from infected regions. Others set up roadblocks or required travelers to carry health certificates from their home authorities. While these efforts weren't always effective, they showed an early understanding that movement of people could move disease. Being labeled a danger to public health didn't just mean physical isolation. It also carried heavy social consequences. Neighbors might avoid your family, your business could collapse, and you might find yourself blamed for spreading illness even if you hadn't been sick at all. In some outbreaks, entire communities, often marginalized groups like beggars, foreigners, or religious minorities, were accused of causing the disease and persecuted as a result. Public health, in the medieval sense, could quickly become a tool for scapegoating. For all its cruelty, medieval isolation practices sometimes worked. Separating infectious patients, even without understanding germs, slowed the spread of disease. They also left thousands to die alone, cut off from their families, with little more than a prayer for comfort. If you became a public health problem in the Middle Ages, your world shrank to the walls of a pest house, the grounds of a leper colony, or the reach of a plague doctor's cane. The message from the healthy was clear: better you than us. In the Middle Ages, the female body was a mystery wrapped in superstition and bound by religious doctrine. Most of what was known about women's health came from ancient medical texts written by men who had never seen a birth in their lives, combined with folklore and a heavy dose of moral judgment. Women had a unique set of medical challenges: menstruation, pregnancy, childbirth, and menopause, not to mention all the same illnesses men faced. Plus, the occasional accusation of witchcraft if they sought too much control over their own health. And while there were skilled and trusted practitioners in women's medicine, their methods often existed in tension with the church, male physicians, and local custom. For most women, the key figure in healthcare was the midwife. She was usually an experienced older woman in the community, trained through years of hands-on practice rather than formal study. Her skill could mean the difference between life and death during childbirth, and she was often called on for other women's matters, treating menstrual problems, offering fertility advice, and helping with newborn care. A good midwife carried a mental library of remedies, herbal infusions to ease labor pains, oils to massage the abdomen, and poultices for postpartum swelling. She knew the best birthing positions and how to coax a stubborn baby into the world with her hands alone. She was also a figure of authority in the birthing chamber, where men, including fathers, were often forbidden. But midwives walked a dangerous line. Too much success, and whispers of sorcery might follow. Too little, and they could be blamed for the tragedy. In some regions, they had to swear oaths of loyalty to the church, promising never to use magic and to report any signs of heresy. In the Middle Ages, childbirth was one of the most dangerous experiences a woman could face. Without antiseptics, anesthesia, or an understanding of infection, complications like obstructed labor, hemorrhage, or sepsis could be fatal within hours. Labor often took place at home, in a warm room with a fire burning and herbs hung to purify the air. The midwife would direct the mother's positioning, sometimes squatting on a special birthing stool, sometimes on hands and knees. Assistants might fan her, give her herbal teas, or whisper prayers. If the labor stalled, the midwife might try to reposition the baby manually, a risky and exhausting procedure. In extreme cases, she might resort to folk remedies, tying charms around the mother's waist, burning certain herbs, or even placing a sacred relic on her abdomen. There was no concept of cesarean section as a life-saving procedure for both mother and child. If performed at all, it was usually after the mother had died, in an attempt to save the baby. Medieval ideas about menstruation were a mix of observation, humor theory, and wild superstition. Menstrual blood was sometimes seen as a dangerous substance, toxic to crops, capable of blunting knives, and even causing illness in men. At the same time, regular menstruation was considered essential for balancing a woman's humors. A missed period could lead to prescriptions for bloodletting or purgatives to unblock the system. Fertility advice ranged from the somewhat sensible, rest, good diet, herbal tonics, to the bizarre. Some recommended wearing amulets containing dried animal parts. Others suggested certain sexual positions aligned with astrological signs. Contraception existed, but was discouraged or outright banned by the church, and methods varied wildly in reliability, from herbal pessaries to prolonged breastfeeding. The weeks after childbirth were known as the lying-in period, during which the new mother was expected to rest and recover. In wealthier households, she might be confined to a bed, tended by servants, and fed nourishing broths. In poorer homes, rest was a luxury, and women often returned to work within days. Postpartum infections, then called childbed fever, were common and often fatal. Treatments included herbal poultices, purifying baths, and prayers, but without understanding of bacteria, prevention was non-existent. Some midwives also acted as wet nurses, feeding and caring for babies whose mothers had died or were unable to nurse. Wet nursing was a recognized profession, though it came with its own risks of disease transmission. Women's health was deeply entangled with morality and religion. A woman who sought to terminate a pregnancy or control her fertility risked accusations of sin or witchcraft. Those who suffered from infertility might be told it was God's will or punishment. Even in illness unrelated to reproduction, women were sometimes treated differently from men, prescribed milder treatments, or conversely, subjected to harsher measures if their symptoms were interpreted as hysteria. The very word comes from the Greek hystera, meaning womb, reflecting the belief that many ailments in women were caused by a wandering or malfunctioning uterus. In short, women's healthcare in the Middle Ages was a blend of practical skill, inherited wisdom, superstition, and moral oversight. For every capable midwife or healer, there was a risk of dangerous remedies, religious condemnation, or sheer bad luck. Surviving childbirth was an achievement. Staying healthy afterward was a triumph. If the medieval physician was the theorist and the barber-surgeon the hands-on fixer, the apothecary was the supplier, part pharmacist, part chemist, part alchemist, and part enthusiastic amateur poisoner. His shop was where medicine met the marketplace, where you could buy everything from soothing balms to powders that could kill you faster than the disease you were trying to treat. The apothecary's workspace was a feast for the senses. Shelves lined with jars of colored powders and dried herbs, bundles of roots hanging from the rafters, and strange animal parts preserved in oils or spirits. The air was thick with the mixed aromas of spices, resins, and something faintly metallic. If you could afford it, this was where your prescription, whether written by a university-trained physician or described by your neighbor, was turned into something tangible. And in a world without regulation, what you got was entirely dependent on the skill, honesty, and sanity of the apothecary behind the counter. Not everything on the apothecary's shelf was dangerous. Many remedies started with plants that genuinely had medicinal effects: mint and fennel for digestion, chamomile for calming the nerves, sage for sore throats, and garlic for infections, all had some degree of value. Spices like cinnamon and cloves were prized not just for flavor, but for their supposed ability to warm the body and drive out cold humors. Saffron was so expensive it sometimes adulterated with cheaper plants, but when pure, it was believed to lift the spirits and combat melancholy. Still, even these relatively safe remedies could be risky in the wrong hands. Without standard measurements, the apothecary's pinch of an herb could range from helpful to harmful. The real hazards started with the mineral ingredients. Lead compounds were used in ointments for skin conditions, despite their toxicity. Mercury appeared in treatments for everything from syphilis to lice, administered as ointments, vapors, or even ingested in small doses. Antimony, a shiny metalloid, was popular as a purgative, meant to clean out the body from both ends. It worked, in the sense that it caused violent vomiting and diarrhea, but it could also cause organ failure. Sulfur was used for skin diseases and fumigations, filling the patient's room with choking yellow smoke in an attempt to cleanse the air. Animal ingredients could be just as unsettling. Ground-up deer horn was a tonic. Crushed pearls were thought to strengthen the heart. Powdered crab's eyes, actually small stones from a crab's stomach, were given for indigestion. musk from the glands of deer, beaver castoreum, and even dried-up human blood found their way into recipes. In some cases, these ingredients had symbolic rather than medicinal value: strength from the stag, longevity from the tortoise, purity from the pearl. One of the strangest was mummy powder, imported from Egypt, made from ground-up embalmed bodies and used to stop bleeding or heal bruises. It was expensive and exotic, a kind of luxury medicine, but the apothecary might also have a local version made from executed criminals. Trade routes brought in ingredients from far-flung places: frankincense and myrrh from Arabia, cinnamon from Ceylon, nutmeg from the Spice Islands. These exotic imports were thought to have powerful medicinal properties simply because they were rare and costly. Dragon's blood, a deep red resin from a tropical tree, was sold as a healing powder, while bezoar stones, calcified masses from the stomachs of goats, were touted as universal antidotes to poison. The fact that these often didn't work didn't stop them from commanding enormous prices. In theory, the apothecary followed the physician's orders exactly. In practice, he often adjusted recipes based on what he had on hand, what the patient could afford, or his own opinions. Sometimes this meant substituting one herb for another. Sometimes it meant leaving out an ingredient entirely. Not always a bad thing when the missing ingredient was mercury. Apothecaries also made up their own patent medicines, secret recipes they claimed could cure multiple ailments. These could be herbal tonics, wine infused with spices, or thick syrups laced with opium for cough relief. The latter certainly worked at stopping coughs, mainly by putting the patient to sleep for hours. Visiting the apothecary could be a lifesaver or a death sentence. Without any regulation, there were no guarantees about purity, dosage, or even authenticity. Powdered pearls might actually be chalk. Saffron could be colored marigold petals. A safe tonic might contain enough mercury to slowly poison you. But for many people, the apothecary represented hope. His shop was a place where ailments were taken seriously, where remedies were crafted to order, and where a customer could walk away with something tangible: a jar, a vial, a packet that promised relief. In an age when most illnesses were met with prayer or resignation, that promise was often worth the risk. The apothecary's shelf was a microcosm of medieval medicine itself, a mix of genuine remedies, hopeful nonsense, and outright danger. You might find something that eased your pain, or something that made sure you never felt anything again. If medieval hospitals and physicians couldn't heal you, there was also a higher authority to appeal to, and for many, that was the ultimate form of medicine. In the Middle Ages, the line between spiritual care and physical treatment wasn't just blurred, it was almost non-existent. Illness was often seen as the result of sin, demonic influence, or divine testing, and that meant a cure might just as easily come from a chapel as from a surgery. In this worldview, prayer was not a desperate last resort, it was an essential first step. Pilgrimages, holy relics, and blessings from saints could be prescribed as readily as an herbal tonic. But just as physicians might tailor remedies to the patient's humors, the Church tailored spiritual medicine to the type of illness and the perceived cause. Medieval Christians often interpreted disease as a punishment for sin or a way for God to bring a soul closer to Him. If your crops failed and you fell ill, it might be a sign to confess your sins. If your child became sick, it could be seen as a test of your faith. The logic was simple. If the soul could be healed, the body might follow. This belief was reinforced by the occasional recovery after prayer, which was taken as proof of divine intervention. The fact that some illnesses resolved naturally, or the diagnosis had been wrong, didn't diminish the conviction. Relics, physical objects associated with saints, were a cornerstone of spiritual medicine. These could be bones, hair, clothing, or even items the saint had touched. They were thought to carry the saint's holiness and, by extension, the power to heal. Pilgrims traveled vast distances to touch or be near these sacred objects. A drop of water that had washed a relic could be drunk as a cure. A cloth rubbed against it could be tied around a wound. Some relics became famous for specific miracles. Saint Apollonia's teeth were invoked for dental pain, while Saint Roch was called upon for plague victims. Relics were often housed in ornate reliquaries, golden, jewel-encrusted cases displayed prominently in churches or cathedrals. On feast days, they might be carried in processions so that the sick could approach them without traveling far. For more serious or chronic conditions, a pilgrimage might be prescribed. This meant traveling, sometimes hundreds of miles, to a holy site known for its healing miracles. Lourdes in France and Santiago de Compostela in Spain are well-known later examples, but in the Middle Ages, every region had its own destinations. The journey itself was seen as part of the cure, an act of penance or devotion. Pilgrims might walk barefoot, fast along the way, or carry heavy loads to demonstrate sincerity. Upon arrival, they would attend Mass, touch relics, bathe in sacred springs, or sleep overnight in the church in hopes of a healing vision. Clergy could also be called directly to the bedside. A priest might bless the sick with holy water, anoint them with consecrated oil, or place a relic on their body while reciting prayers. In cases where illness was believed to be caused by demonic possession, which could include symptoms we'd now recognize as epilepsy or certain mental illnesses, an exorcism might be performed. Exorcisms ranged from quiet prayers to dramatic rituals involving holy water, crucifixes, and the commanding of spirits to depart. While many sufferers were simply left exhausted, the occasional improvement was enough to keep the practice alive. Even secular healers often incorporated religious elements into their practice. A physician might recite a psalm before surgery, or an apothecary might mix holy water into a remedy. Folk healers, too, could blend Christian prayers with older pagan charms, invoking both God and nature spirits in the same breath. The Church itself sometimes endorsed these combinations, seeing no contradiction between using herbs God had provided and invoking His name over them. Other times, especially when unapproved rituals were involved, the Church condemned them as superstition or witchcraft. Even when prayer and relics didn't cure the body, they offered something else: comfort. In an age where pain relief was minimal and death was a constant companion, the assurance that suffering had meaning could be powerful medicine in itself. Families took solace in knowing they had done everything possible, spiritually and physically, for their loved ones. In the medieval mind, medicine by prayer and relic wasn't in competition with physical treatments. It was part of the same toolkit. Whether you were sipping a bitter herbal tonic or touching the bones of a saint, the goal was the same: to tip the balance in your favor, with help from both earthly skill and heavenly grace. In the Middle Ages, illness didn't just arrive at random, at least not in the minds of those living through it. Sickness had its own calendar, tied to the rhythms of the year, the availability of food, and the way people worked and lived with the seasons. Physicians, folk healers, and ordinary people alike noticed patterns. Certain ailments struck in winter, others in summer, and the changing months brought their own particular risks. Without germ theory, these patterns were explained through the lens of the four humors and environmental factors. A cold, wet winter was said to encourage phlegm. A hot, dry summer inflamed choler. Healers adjusted their treatments and their warnings according to the season, just as farmers adjusted their planting and harvests. Winter was the time of coughs, fevers, and lingering chills. Houses were smoky from indoor fires, windows stayed shut, and people huddled together for warmth, perfect conditions for respiratory diseases to spread. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, and influenza-like illnesses flourished. Physicians believed winter's cold and damp encouraged the buildup of phlegm, which clogged the chest and dulled the body's energy. Treatments often focused on warming and drying the patient. Hot spiced wine, mustard plasters on the chest, and beds piled high with blankets. Bloodletting was discouraged in the dead of winter unless absolutely necessary. Cold weather was thought to slow the body's recovery after such a loss. For the poor, malnutrition deepened winter's toll. Fresh produce was scarce, meat was rare, and diets relied heavily on stored grains and salted fish. Weak bodies meant easy prey for seasonal illness. Spring was seen as a time to cleanse the body, just as the land was cleared and planted. Physicians often describe bloodletting and purgatives to shake off the sluggish humors of winter. Lighter foods like young greens and fresh herbs returned to the diet, and broths made from early vegetables were thought to refresh the system. But spring also brought its own hazards. Meltwater and rain turned streets to mud, contaminating wells and rivers with runoff from latrines. Waterborne diseases like dysentery and cholera were common. And as people resumed outdoor work, injuries from plowing, planting, and livestock became more frequent. Summer was the season of heat, flies, and disease outbreaks. In the humoral model, summer heat and dryness increased yellow bile, making people more irritable and prone to fevers. Cooling treatments, cucumber, lettuce, cold baths, were prescribed to counteract the season's hot influence. But heat also meant food spoiled quickly, drawing vermin. Fleas and lice multiplied, carrying diseases from person to person. Water sources shrank and grew stagnant, making them breeding grounds for bacteria, though medieval people saw it as corruption of the water, not microbial contamination. Summer also brought plague season in many regions. The 14th century Black Death spread most ferociously in warm months when fleas on rats were most active. Towns sometimes reeked in summer, their waste disposal overwhelmed by heat and population density, and physicians advised carrying aromatic herbs to ward off the stench, and, they believed, the disease. Autumn was a mix of abundance and exhaustion. The harvest brought feasts and fresh food, but also grueling labor. Cuts, bruises, and crush injuries from threshing and carting grain were common. As the weather cooled and dampened, fevers returned, sometimes blamed on bad air from rotting vegetation, sometimes on overindulgence after leaner months. Autumn was also associated with outbreaks of ague, intermittent fevers that may have been malaria in marshy regions or other mosquito-borne illnesses. Physicians might recommend strengthening foods like meats and thick pottages to prepare the body for winter, alongside tonics of wine and spices to warm the blood. For medieval healers, understanding the seasonal ebb and flow of sickness was part of good practice. Treatments and preventative measures were timed not just to the patient's condition, but to the calendar. A cough in January might be treated entirely different from one in August, even if the symptoms were identical. This cyclical view of health also shaped religious and cultural practices. Certain feast days were linked to healing rituals, and some saints were invoked more often in specific seasons. Pilgrimages might be planned for times when the roads were safer and the weather less likely to worsen an illness. In a world without vaccines or modern medicine, survival often meant adapting to the season's challenges. Whether it was braving winter fevers, enduring summer plagues, or avoiding injury in the harvest rush, medieval people lived, and often died, in rhythm with the year's illnesses. The seasons didn't just bring changes in weather, they brought a predictable parade of dangers, each with its own set of cures, charms, and old wives' warnings. In the Middle Ages, the human mind was as much a mystery as the stars in the sky or the depths of the sea. While medieval physicians had elaborate theories about blood, bile, and phlegm, their understanding of mental illness was fragmentary at best and tangled in superstition, religion, and fear. If your thoughts or behavior fell outside what your neighbors considered normal, the cause could be traced, in their minds, to one of three main sources: a problem with the body's humors, a punishment or test from God, or interference by the devil. And the treatments they offered depended entirely on which explanation they chose to believe. The humoral theory extended to the mind as easily as it did to the body. Too much black bile supposedly led to melancholia, sadness, lethargy, and withdrawal from life. Too much yellow bile could cause mania, aggression, erratic behavior, and bursts of energy. Some mental illnesses were lumped together under colorful names. Epilepsy, for instance, was called the falling sickness and could be seen either as a natural affliction or a sign of possession. Hysteria, from the Greek hystera, meaning womb, was thought to be caused by a wandering uterus in women, which supposedly drifted around the body, causing mood swings, fainting, or even madness. If symptoms were dramatic, shouting at invisible people, convulsing, tearing at clothing, refusing food, it was easy for observers to see demonic hands at work. In such cases, the healer of choice was not a physician, but a priest. The afflicted might be subjected to exorcism, prayers, holy water, the sign of the cross, and sometimes more extreme rituals. Chronic conditions could result in the sufferer being isolated, chained, or even confined to a monastery where they were expected to live out their days in penance. Not all clergy saw the devil in mental illness. Some argued that it was a physical ailment like any other, but fear of the supernatural was never far away. Formal mental hospitals barely existed in the early Middle Ages. Those who could not be cared for by their families might be housed in monasteries, where they received basic food and shelter, but little specialized treatment. By the late medieval period, institutions like Bethlehem Royal Hospital in London, later infamous as Bedlam, began to emerge. These places were intended to confine and manage the mentally ill, though management often meant chains, beatings, or neglect. Treatment, when offered, might include bloodletting, purgatives, or herbal sedatives like valerian or poppy juice. Not all care was harsh. Folk healers sometimes prescribed calming teas, aromatic baths, or amulets meant to ward off troubling thoughts. Lavender, chamomile, and lemon balm were used to soothe restlessness. Music, storytelling, and gentle exercise were occasionally recommended for melancholy, a surprisingly humane approach, though it sat alongside more dubious cures like wearing dried wolf's heart around the neck. Astrology also crept into diagnosis and treatment. If your madness coincided with a particular planetary alignment, a healer might wait until the stars shifted before attempting a cure. When mental illness struck the powerful, it became a public affair. King Charles VI of France, also known as Charles the Mad, suffered episodes where he failed to recognize his own family or believed he was made of glass and might shatter if touched. Treatments ranged from baths and prayers to complete political isolation. Such cases often reinforce the idea that madness was an act of God, either to humble a ruler or punish a nation. Mental illness carried a heavy social stigma. The afflicted might be feared, mocked, or treated as cursed. In smaller communities, those with mild symptoms could sometimes live relatively normal lives, especially if they were able to work. But for many, illness meant social isolation or lifelong dependence on charity. Families sometimes hid relatives with mental illness to avoid shame, or claimed their strange behavior was a sign of holy favor rather than affliction. In rare cases, a mad person was tolerated as a harmless eccentric, but more often they were seen as dangerous or pitiable. In the medieval world, the mind was just another battlefield between the physical, the spiritual, and the supernatural. Care could be gentle or brutal, rooted in observation or steeped in fear. And while a few approaches showed glimmers of compassion or insight, most sufferers lived at the mercy of their community's beliefs about what madness really meant. Looking back at everything we've covered, the bloodletting, the purges, the surgery without anesthesia, the dangerous folk cures, the poisonous apothecary jars, and the prayers over your sickbed, it's hard not to wonder how anyone survived the medical system of the Middle Ages at all. And the short answer is, a lot of them didn't. But those who did survive did so thanks to a combination of luck, natural resilience, and the occasionally genuinely helpful treatment. It wasn't that medieval people were weaker or sicker than us, though disease was more common. It's that their world was stacked with hazards that modern patients don't have to think twice about. The biggest killer wasn't the knife, the plague, or the poison. It was infection. With no understanding of germs, there was no concept of sterilizing instruments, washing hands, or keeping wounds clean. Surgeons might go straight from lancing a boil to amputating a limb without rinsing their blade. Bandages were reused until they fell apart, and pus was often seen as a good sign. Laudable pus meant the body was supposedly healing. Minor cuts could become lethal. A splinter, left untreated, might fester into a full-blown septic infection. Toothaches could turn into deadly abscesses. Women recovering from childbirth faced high risks of childbed fever, a postpartum infection that could spread rapidly and kill within days. Even before illness struck, many medieval people were living on the nutritional edge. Diets varied between region and season, but for most, meals were heavy on bread, pottage, and whatever vegetables were available, with meat a rare luxury. Malnutrition weakened the immune system, making people more susceptible to disease and slower to recover. Vitamin deficiencies could lead to scurvy, rickets, or pellagra. A poor diet also made wounds heal slower and infections harder to fight off. Living in the countryside often meant hours or days of travel to reach any kind of medical help. By the time a patient reached the hospital or healer, their condition might have worsened beyond repair. And care cost money, not always cash, but payment in goods or labor, which meant the poorest often went without. Even if you found a healer, their skill level was a gamble. A brilliant surgeon might save your life. A careless one might end it faster. The average patient had no way of knowing which they'd get. Many treatments not only failed to help, but actively harmed the patient. Heavy bleeding could cause shock. Mercury ointments could poison. Cleansing purges could leave someone dangerously dehydrated. Sometimes the treatment killed faster than the disease. Even remedies with potential benefits could go wrong without precise dosing. An herbal infusion might ease pain in small amounts, but cause organ failure if overused. And without written prescriptions or consistent measurements, every batch was a gamble. In towns, patients were often treated in crowded wards where all kinds of illnesses mingled. You could arrive with a broken leg and leave, if you left at all, with dysentery, typhus, or the plague. Hospitals were not places of quarantine, they were breeding grounds for disease. During epidemics, the risk multiplied. Plague victims were sometimes housed alongside the merely sick or wounded, ensuring the disease spread like wildfire. In truth, most recoveries came down to the patient's own immune system. If your illness was mild, or if your body could fight it off before the treatment killed you, you stood a chance. Young, otherwise healthy people fared better. The elderly, malnourished, or chronically ill often didn't survive. Luck also played a role in avoiding secondary infections, encountering a competent healer, or simply not being prescribed something deadly. Surviving the medieval medical system was like walking through a minefield. You could do everything right and still not make it. If the odds were so bad, why seek treatment at all? Because doing nothing wasn't much better. At least with a healer, there was a chance, however small, that you might get the right herb, the right wound care, or the right advice. And there was always the comfort of being seen, of having someone take your illness seriously in a world where sickness was isolating. Even when healers failed, the rituals, prayers, and human contact could give patients and families a sense of purpose in the face of suffering. In the end, surviving medieval medicine was a triumph of biology, fortune, and stubborn willpower. It was, quite literally, a miracle, though one more often credited to saints than to science. And if you walked away from your treatment alive, you had every reason to be grateful, and to hope you'd never need it again. After wandering through the wards, market stalls, plague houses, and back rooms of medieval medicine, one truth stands out like a red-hot cauterizing iron. The safest medical plan in the Middle Ages was simply not to get sick in the first place. Of course, avoiding illness in a world where clean water was a luxury, rats were part of the landscape, and epidemics swept through every few decades was easier said than done. You could eat well, keep warm, and steer clear of obviously sick neighbors, and still find yourself face to face with Brother Thomas holding a lancet. Your choices were grim. You could go to a hospital, where your illness might be treated with prayer, overcrowding, and the occasional leech. You could see a physician, if you could afford one, and be prescribed a careful regimen of purging, bleeding, and mysterious powders. You could visit the Barber-Surgeon for a quick tooth pull, boil lancing, or seasonal bloodletting, maybe while getting your hair trimmed. Or you could try the village wise woman's latest remedy, involving herbs, charms, and possibly a dead frog. Each option came with the chance, often a small one, that it might help. But it also came with the risk that the treatment would make you worse, or that you'd pick up something even more deadly in the process. In a way, medieval healthcare was a lottery. A handful of patients hit the jackpot. Their wounds healed cleanly, their fevers broke, their coughs faded. Many more drew the losing ticket, felled by infection, poisoned by medicine, or simply worn out by their illness. And yet, people kept playing. Because the alternative, doing nothing, felt like giving up. That's the part that's easy to forget when we look back and shake our heads at the leeches, the mercury ointments, and the mummified body powder. For people in the Middle Ages, these weren't absurdities. They were hope, sometimes the only hope available. Today, we have antibiotics, anesthesia, and an understanding of germ theory. We can get a broken leg set without being bled half to death. Childbirth is no longer the leading cause of death for young women in most parts of the world. You can have surgery without being awake for it, and your odds of dying from a toothache are almost non-existent. And yet, medieval medicine laid the groundwork, not because it worked well, but because it kept the tradition of trying. It was centuries of trial, error, and human stubbornness that eventually led us to the medical science we take for granted. If you somehow woke up in the 14th century tomorrow, the best advice I could give you is to avoid injury, steer clear of strange meat pies, and keep your distance from anyone coughing in the market. Don't drink the water unless it's been boiled. Be polite to your local healer, and for the love of all things holy, don't let anyone near you with a red-hot iron unless it's absolutely necessary. In a world where survival itself was a kind of miracle, sometimes the smartest move wasn't to seek the cure, it was to avoid needing one.